poem that we'll be discussing in this video is Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem In Memoriam. As you might recall from our class discussions, In Memoriam was written years after the death of Alfred Lord Tennyson's best friend, Arthur. And the poem captures not only a sense of his grief, but also of his vision of life and death and redemption through God's divine plan. The poem is full of scriptural ideas and interpretations of theology, which we're going to focus on in this discussion today. At the beginning of the poem, before he launches into a discussion of his grief, Alfred Lord Tennyson spends a good deal of time discussing the situation of his time period and how it relates to God. You notice here that in the first stanza he addresses God and begins to discuss the difficulty of having faith in God during a time in history when Christian faith was diminishing. In fact, he even suggests here at the end of the first stanza, they must believe where he cannot prove. Meaning at some points in Victorian philosophy, Christians were challenged to demonstrate what they believed using scientific analysis or experimentation, and Tennyson suggests that that is impossible. He also, though, points out that it is through God that man takes hope against death and the despair that comes with death. He says that God made us death as an echo of sort of John Donne's ideas in his Holy Sonnet. God created death, and his foot is on the skull which he has made, the skull most likely representing the reality of death. Later in the poem, he explains that the purpose of humanity is to return our wills to God, or to submit them to God's ultimate will. Our wills are ours to make them thine, he says. Also, he discusses briefly the way that Victorian philosophies, in particular modernism, lacked the power of Christian faith. He calls them little systems. Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. Meaning that God's revelation is more powerful and complete than what our minds can apprehend through science and reasoning, which was a focus of Victorian thinking. At the end of this section of the poem that we examined in class, he talks about his sin and repents of it, including the sin of his grief, which he seems to feel was excessive and not done completely out of faith in God's redemption. Before he begins discussing his grief, he even invites God to make him wise and to forgive him where his ramblings and grief fail. So the poem illustrates a contrasting viewpoint to the modernist understanding of life and death and of reason. In Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, he highlights that his hope in life and his understanding of life are both rooted in God's revelation and his faith that God can heal and deliver from death. This is one thing that directs the rest of the poem, and one thing you may be able to comment on our upcoming test.